The archives of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania hold 4 deaths that appear accidental on their brittle, yellowed pages. A lawyer thrown from his horse on a fog-heavy morning. A banker drowned in the shallow bite of Mill Creek. A circuit judge struck down by sudden illness at Harvest's Peak. And a sheriff found lifeless at the bottom of his own well. But what those archives conceal, what the law refused to inscribe, is that every single one of these men was bound to the same family. Each wore a ring placed upon his hand by one of 4 sisters: Bridget, Catherine, Margaret, and Sarah Brennan, the Brennan daughters who vowed, beneath candlelight and stone walls, that no law, no man, no institution would ever sever them. By 1837, their father lay buried beneath the frozen earth, and with him the shield of his authority. Patrick Brennan had been an immigrant who carved out dominion from soil, 847 acres of rich Pennsylvania farmland, his fortress, his altar. But inheritance law did not care for altars. With no sons, the law demanded division. The farm would splinter, fall into pieces, swallowed by creditors, absorbed by neighbors. To men, inheritance was statute. To the Brennan sisters, it was violation. Understand this: Lancaster County in the 1830s was not a land of mercy. To lose property was to lose bloodline, to forfeit history. And the Brennan sisters, forged by their father's fire, would not yield. Bridget, the eldest, hid the mind of a strategist beneath modest glances. Catherine possessed the uncanny talent to read the weaknesses of others as if they were scripture. Margaret, ethereal in her beauty, carried a blade of practicality behind her angel's face. And Sarah, the youngest, wielded her voice like a weapon, becoming whatever mask the hour demanded. Together they whispered in the farmhouse kitchen, lamplight flickering across their faces, shadows swallowing their youth. Marriage was supposed to scatter them, yet they conceived something darker. Marriage would not disperse the Brennan daughters. Marriage would be their instrument. Husbands would arrive not as saviors, but as pawns, and pawns could be sacrificed. The first death came scarcely 14 months after Patrick Brennan's funeral. But before we walk into that fog, I ask you this: comment below the place you now listen from, so I know where the truth is being heard, and type these words twice. The veil is broken. This ritual binds you to the knowledge you're about to inherit. Subscribe, for what comes next will not be found in any court record. The first of the sisters to strike was Bridget, eldest by 5 years. She carried the weight of her father's command on her shoulders. If Patrick Brennan's farm was to endure, it would be Bridget who ensured it. And she saw clearly what her sisters could not yet admit: land is not secured by prayer, or patience, or the mercy of neighbors. Land is secured by eliminating those who stand between you and the deed. Her chosen husband was Thomas Weatherby, a lawyer from Harrisburg. He was broad-shouldered, proud of his own rhetoric, the type of man who mistook a sharp tongue for intelligence. Thomas believed he had married a quiet, obedient farm girl. What he had truly wed was a woman who studied inheritance law by candlelight while he slept, memorizing the clauses that could be bent, broken, or rewritten in her favor. Thomas liked to ride at dawn. His horse, a bay stallion named Gideon, was spirited but aging, too prone to stumble when the road grew slick. Bridget did not need to lift a blade or pull a trigger. All she needed was rain and a stone carefully loosened on the road's edge. That November morning, the fog hung so thick the world seemed reduced to breath alone. When Gideon's hoof struck that displaced stone, the horse buckled, and Thomas was flung. His neck snapped against the frozen earth, a single crack like timber splitting under winter's weight. Witnesses said it was tragedy, a cruel accident. But Bridget's eyes, dry as parchment, told another story. At the funeral, the sisters stood shoulder to shoulder, veils covering their faces. They played their roles with precision. Mourners fragile in black, whispering prayers, but behind their silence pulsed a victory no hymn could disguise. With Thomas gone, Bridget inherited his holdings, property, coin, and, most importantly, legal leverage. The Brennan farm, once threatened with dissolution, now had a shield written in her name. But accidents breed suspicion when they happen too neatly. And Lancaster, a county bound by gossip as much as by law, began to murmur. Why did Bridget show no grief? Why did fortune fall to her so swiftly? Catherine listened to those whispers with interest. Where Bridget carved paths with calculation, Catherine wielded charm. If her sister's strategy was stone, hers was silk. And already, Catherine's eyes had fixed on her own husband-to-be, an ambitious banker whose vault would become her battlefield. Catherine Brennan married for numbers. Not affection, not stability, numbers. In ledgers and coins stacked like miniature fortresses, she saw the survival of her bloodline. Her husband Elias Harrow was a banker in Lancaster proper. Tall, gaunt, and proud of his intellect, he mistook Catherine's attentiveness for awe. But Catherine was not listening to Elias, she was listening to the arithmetic of his vault. Unlike Bridget, Catherine did not rely on chance or the break of bone on stone. Her mind was patient, weaving plots like threads on a loom. She studied Elias's weaknesses with a devotion that mimicked love. He drank brandy heavily in the evenings. He trusted no one but his wife with his accounts, and he adored fishing in Mill Creek, where the water ran shallow and deceptively calm. Catherine proposed the outing herself. "You've been overworked," she told him, her voice soft, convincing. "Let the creek clear your head." Elias, flattered by her concern, agreed. On a June afternoon in 1839, the two rowed out together, rods in hand, laughter rehearsed. The creek reflected sunlight like shards of glass, dazzling the eye, masking its dangers. Catherine set the stage. She guided Elias toward a bank where the soil was soft, the edge unstable. She poured brandy into his cup until his words slurred, his balance faltered. Then, with a touch so subtle it might have been mistaken for a lover's hand, she shifted his weight forward. Elias slipped. The splash was brief, the water shallow, yet he thrashed as if dragged by unseen hands. His boots filled, the mud clutched, and the brandy dulled his instincts. Catherine did not scream. She did not leap to help. She watched as the surface stilled, as bubbles burst one last time. When townsfolk asked later, her story was flawless. Elias stumbled, struck his head, drowned before she could save him. Her sobs at the funeral were convincing enough to silence suspicion, for a time. And the inheritance she acquired was enough to fortify the Brennan estate further, pushing back creditors, binding more of the land under their collective control. But Lancaster tongues wagged again. 2 husbands gone in scarcely 3 years. 2 sisters widowed, yet curiously secured. The air grew tense around the Brennan name, and in that tension, Margaret, the 3rd sister, saw her opportunity. She was the beauty, the angel-faced one. But angels, when cornered, reveal their wings are edged in steel. Margaret Brennan was the most dangerous of the 4. Not because she schemed with Bridget's precision or seduced with Catherine's subtlety, but because the world underestimated her. Beauty made her untouchable. Men gazed upon her as if she were an emblem of innocence, a creature of softness. They forgot that beauty, when sharpened, becomes a blade more lethal than steel. Her marriage was to Judge Henry Calloway, a man 20 years her senior. Calloway had carved his name into Lancaster's courts with ruthless efficiency, a judge feared for his cold sentences and admired for his unwavering authority. To him, Margaret was a prize, a wife to adorn his reputation. He believed her silence meant obedience. In truth, her silence was the sheath for the dagger she carried inside her mind. Margaret studied her husband as one studies a sickness, observing its patterns, its weaknesses, its inevitable decline. Calloway's weakness was vanity. He trusted no one but indulged endlessly in remedies, powders, and tonics that promised to preserve his health. He feared death with a desperation bordering on obsession. And Margaret, the dutiful wife, was always there to prepare his draughts. The poison she chose was subtle, harvested from roots that grew wild in the thickets near the farm. She diluted it, drop by drop, into his nightly tonics. Not enough to kill him outright. That would invite suspicion. No, Margaret believed in erosion. Slowly, quietly, she let the poison gnaw at him. His skin grew pale, his eyes sunken. Physicians were summoned, baffled by his decline. They called it fever, consumption, a wasting illness. None thought to question the gentle wife who sat by his bedside, spooning broth to his lips. By the time Calloway collapsed during harvest season of 1841, his body was a shell. Margaret's tears fell in perfect measure, her grief displayed with such artistry that even the doctors praised her devotion. The community pitied her, whispered of her tragedy. So young, so beautiful, widowed too soon. And in the silence between whispers, the Brennan estate grew larger, secured further by Calloway's fortune. 3 husbands gone, 3 sisters widowed. 3 fortunes absorbed, yet still, suspicion festered. Neighbors muttered. Clergymen avoided their eyes during Mass. and the law, though blind on paper, began to sense patterns it could not name, which left Sarah, the youngest, the voice of the four, the sister whose mask could shift from lamb to serpent in the span of a breath. Her path would be bloodier, swifter, and far less subtle. Sarah Brennan was the voice of the sisters, the mask maker, the one who could smile and disarm suspicion with a single word. Where Bridget plotted, Catherine coaxed, and Margaret eroded, Sarah struck. The youngest Brennan's sister was not patient. She was fire. Her marriage was to Sheriff William Dunn, the man meant to guard Lancaster County from lawlessness. Irony draped itself over their union like a shroud. Dunn believed he had claimed a radiant wife, a woman whose youth and charm would soften his hard profession. What he did not realize was that he had invited the serpent into his home and given her the keys to his well. Dunn was no gentle husband. He drank heavily, carried his authority into the household with the same force he used against petty criminals. Neighbors heard arguments, the slamming of doors, the sharp edges of Sarah's voice cutting through the night. But to the public, Sarah wore perfection. She played the loyal wife at gatherings, the dutiful parishioner in church pews. Her deception was flawless. The plan unfolded in late summer of 1843. Sarah knew Dunn's routines. He often drew water himself at dawn, before the heat grew oppressive. The well behind their farmhouse was old, its stones slick with moss. One morning, Sarah rose early, her eyes clear, her hands steady. She left the bucket rope coiled loosely, frayed just enough to betray its strength. She dampened the stone rim with oil from the lantern, invisible in dim light. When Dunn leaned over to draw his water, the rope snapped, his weight pitched forward. Sarah was behind him, close enough that her final push could be dismissed as accident. The sheriff plunged, striking the stone walls as he fell. By the time neighbors were roused by Sarah's screams, Dunn's body was broken at the bottom of the well. The county grieved. A sheriff dead in such a grotesque manner was tragedy enough, but a beautiful young widow, sobbing and clutching her veil, commanded pity. No one dared accuse her, not openly. Yet the whispers grew louder, sharper. 4 sisters, 4 marriages, 4 deaths. Lancaster could no longer dismiss it as coincidence. And still, the Brennan farm expanded, the sisters bound together more tightly than ever, their fortune now beyond question. But power does not grow without shadow, and in those shadows neighbors began to speak words once unthinkable: witchcraft, pact, curse. The sisters had not just inherited land, they had inherited fear. By the autumn of 1843, Lancaster County was no longer blind. 4 men, each tied by law or oath to the Brennan sisters, had met untimely ends. The farm, once destined for dissolution, was now larger than ever, and still the sisters walked to Sunday service in black lace, faces veiled, postures unbroken. Whispers became venom. Women in the marketplace clutched their children tighter when the Brennans passed. Men lowered their voices, muttering in taverns of curses, of plots of a feminine pact sealed with blood. Words like witchcraft crawled back into the open, old Puritan suspicions reignited under new guise. Yet the sisters moved untouched by fear. Their confidence was its own armor. Bridget, ever the strategist, tightened their accounts, secured contracts, and leveraged allies in the county court. Catherine, her voice honeyed, persuaded creditors that their prosperity was nothing more than providence. Margaret cloaked them in sympathy, her beauty disarming even their harshest detractors. And Sarah, wild, unpredictable Sarah, was the dagger unsheathed when tongues wagged too freely. The county, uneasy, sought explanations that fit within law. Physicians revisited records, scanning for patterns. Clergymen whispered in confessionals, testing whether sin might explain death. But suspicion without evidence is smoke without flame. The law could not touch the Brennan sisters, at least not yet. Still, their farmhouse became a place of dread. Travelers avoided its lane. Neighbors crossed themselves when its windows glowed late into the night. They swore they heard voices, 4 voices, chanting in unison, prayers that did not sound like prayers. Others claimed to see lights flicker in the fields, as though the soil itself glowed from beneath. Whether truth or invention, these tales hardened into folklore. The Brennan sisters were no longer simply women. They were symbols of envy, of fear, of defiance against men and the laws they wrote. Their name became a warning whispered to daughters. Choose carefully or you'll end like the Brennans. But beneath the whispers, danger was real. A county cannot tolerate shadows forever, And in 1844, Lancaster's first serious attempt to strike back was formed, not through law, not through trial, but through fire. For when law is powerless, superstition takes the torch. What happened on that night would mark the first open war between the Brennan sisters and the county that sought to erase them. It was the spring of 1844 when Lancaster decided whispers were no longer enough. A county simmering with fear demanded action, and action often wears the mask of violence. The story begins with a tavern gathering where farmers, tradesmen, and two young deacons shared all until courage fermented into hatred. By midnight a plan was born. If the Brennan sisters could not be tried, they would be erased. They came with torches. A mob of 19 men, faces shadowed, boots heavy on the dirt road that led to the Brennan farm. The moon hung low, veiled by drifting clouds, and the only light came from the fire they carried in their hands. Their voices were low at first, mutters about curses, about protecting their wives and daughters. But as the farmhouse came into view, their murmurs grew louder, bolder, rage feeding on rage. Inside, the sisters heard them before they saw the flames. Sarah was the first to laugh. Finally, she whispered, they come to test their courage. Bridget, calm as always, moved quickly, dozing lamps and shuttering windows. Catherine urged silence, her mind already weaving lies for the morning after. And Margaret stood at the center, her beauty now hardened, her eyes reflecting the fire outside. When the mob reached the porch, torches lifted, they expected panic. Instead, the farmhouse stood silent, watching them as though it were alive. One man hurled his torch at the door. Flames licked the wood, but only briefly. Buckets of water, prepared days before, smothered the fire as Bridget threw them with deliberate precision. Then Sarah stepped outside. No veil, no pretense. Her voice carried into the night with a sharpness that made even the bravest falter. "Is this your justice?" she cried. 19 men against 4 widows. Does the law of Lancaster permit cowards to burn women alive? Her words cut deeper than any blade. Several men lowered their torches, shame prickling their skin. Others, drunk on fury, pressed forward. But then came Margaret, her face pale in the firelight, her beauty unsettling even in rage. She fell to her knees, arms raised, whispering prayers, not to God, but in a tongue that sounded foreign, eerie, ancient. The mob wavered. Whispers of witchcraft surged again, but this time the men felt not righteous but hunted, and before another torch could fly, thunder cracked overhead, rain spilling down as if summoned. Torches sputtered, fire hissed into smoke. The men scattered. The sisters had survived, but Lancaster's hatred had only deepened. The mob fled into the storm, their courage drowned as quickly as their torches. But the Brennan sisters did not retreat into silence. No, they understood that survival alone was not enough. Fear once awakened must be sharpened, shaped, turned into a tool. And so, the sisters transformed the night of fire into the beginning of their dominion. The very next morning, Bridget set the narrative. She walked into Lancaster town square dressed not in morning black, but in deep crimson, bold, defiant. She spoke of the attempted burning, of 19 men who sought to destroy 4 widows in the dead of night. Her words spread like wildfire through gossip and confession. She named no names, but every man who had been there felt exposed. Guilt became a chain around their necks. Catherine played her role as well. In hushed tones, she confided to neighbors that God had sent the storm to protect them. She let the idea drip like honey. Divine favor shielded the Brennans. Who, after all, could doubt it? Lightning had cracked, rain had poured, fire had failed. Providence, or something darker, had chosen its side. Margaret took another path. She turned her beauty into lament, allowing tears to fall in public. She let townsfolk see her trembling, her fragile hands clutching rosaries. To the devout, she appeared saintly, a martyr wronged by lawless men. And so the sisters wore 3 masks: defiance, divine protection, and sorrow. But Sarah, the youngest, needed no mask. She prowled taverns, markets, even the church steps, staring into the eyes of men until they looked away. "We know who you are," she whispered once to a farmer who had stood with a torch. "The storm knows too." Within days, rumors spread that Sarah could name men in their dreams, that her laughter carried into their sleep, that those who crossed her saw their cattle sicken, their fields flood. The sisters had no need to curse. Fear did it for them. Crops failed as crops often do. Illness struck as illness always does. But every misfortune was now attributed to the Brennan women, and strangely, this did not weaken them. It made them untouchable. Who would dare raise a hand against women who could call down storms? Who would risk the wrath of God, or devil, on their family? By 1845, the Brennan farm was no longer merely land. It was a fortress of myth, a place where law hesitated to tread. But myths draw attention, and soon Lancaster's whispers would carry beyond county lines. By the spring of 1845, Lancaster's whispers had grown too loud to remain within its borders. Stories of 4 widowed sisters, each husband dead, each inheritance gained, each misfortune shadowed by storms and sickness, began to bleed into neighboring counties. Folklore traveled faster than law. Preachers spoke of it from pulpits, framing the sisters as a warning against female defiance. Opportunists whispered of hidden wealth waiting to be claimed, and investigators, both official and self-appointed, saw a chance for renown. The first outsider to arrive was Reverend Josiah Harker, a fiery preacher from York County. Harker declared the Brennan farm a nest of Jezebels and demanded a public reckoning. He stood in Lancaster Square, Bible raised, promising deliverance if the community would rally to God. His sermons burned with venom, his voice echoing through the cobblestones. But when he led a procession toward the Brennan farmhouse, something strange occurred. The sisters were waiting. Bridget stood at the gate, unflinching, while Catherine's voice carried over the crowd. Does the Reverend seek truth or spectacle? Margaret wept quietly at her side, eyes cast heavenward, and Sarah, smiling faintly, whispered just loud enough for those closest to hear, the Reverend should be careful walking home at night. That evening, a storm gathered without warning. Lightning split a tree on the very road Harker traveled. His horse reared, throwing him into the mud. He survived, but with a shattered leg. By morning, Lancaster whispered again, this time not of Jezebels, but of divine punishment. Harker limped back to York, his crusade unfinished. Next came a pair of investigators from Philadelphia, men of law and ledger. They arrived with questions, combing through wills, inheritance papers, and death records. But the Brennan sisters had prepared too well. Bridget produced documents, signatures, contracts, all in perfect order. Catherine charmed them over dinners, weaving stories of devotion and tragedy. Margaret played the grieving widow flawlessly. And Sarah, well, Sarah stared at them with such intensity that both men confessed later they struggled to sleep during their stay. Within 2 weeks, they returned to Philadelphia empty-handed. The sisters had repelled preacher and law alike. Their myth only swelled larger, feeding on failure. But with fame came danger. For not all who heard of the Brennans sought justice or salvation. Some came hungering for the wealth, the land, the power the sisters held. And when greed knocks at the door, it does not ask permission to enter. By late 1845, the Brennan farm was no longer just land, it was legend, and legends attract vultures. Where preachers had failed and investigators had retreated, others came with simpler ambitions, fortune hunters, drifters, men who believed 4 widows alone on a great estate would be easy prey. The first was Samuel Givens, a drifter with the charm of a card shark and the arrogance of a man who mistook cruelty for strength. He arrived in Lancaster boasting that he would tame the Brennan sisters, that by winter the farm would be his. He was last seen walking the lane toward their farmhouse on a moonless night. Weeks later, his horse returned riderless, hooves caked in mud. The animal wandered the town eyes wide, as though it had galloped through hell. Samuel was never found. Some said he fled east, pockets full of Brennan coin. Others whispered that Sarah had buried him beneath the orchard, his bones feeding the roots. None dared search. Then came brothers Elias and Jonah Wright, opportunists from Baltimore who claimed they had legal rights to Brennan land through distant kinship. They arrived with documents prepared to press their case. But Bridget, calm and meticulous, dissected their claims in the courthouse with surgical precision. Witnesses swore her knowledge of law rivaled that of any attorney. The judge dismissed the case. Humiliated, the Wright brothers lingered, determined to intimidate the sisters into surrender. They were last seen drunk in a tavern, swearing they would ride out at dawn to settle matters. By sunrise, their horses were discovered grazing near Mill Creek. The brothers' bodies were not. Only their boots surfaced days later, carried by the current. Each disappearance added fuel to the fire of superstition. Neighbors spoke of lights in the fields, of women's voices chanting over shallow graves, yet no evidence could be found, no crime proved. The sisters walked freely, their wealth untouched, their power expanding. But while outsiders vanished, Lancaster itself grew restless. Fear of the Brennans was one thing, living beside them was another. Every year the sisters grew richer, every year their influence thickened, and as 1846 dawned, the county began to ask not only what the sisters had done, but what they might do next. The question that haunted Lancaster was no longer who will die next, but who dares to stop them. By 1846, Lancaster's fear had curdled into something sharper, resentment. It was one thing for the Brennan sisters to be whispered of as cursed, even as witches, but it was another for them to thrive while the county's men, its leaders, landowners, and officials, looked weak. Pride is a dangerous fuel, and Lancaster's elites could not allow 4 widows to wield such dominion unchecked, so they met in secret. Behind the closed doors of taverns and Masonic halls, men of wealth and influence plotted. Judge Alistair Morton, a rival of the late Calloway, convened the first meeting. Alongside him sat Reverend Silas Yoder, banker Charles Whitcomb, and a scattering of merchants and farmers whose livelihoods seemed eclipsed by the Brennan shadow. Their aim was simple: dismantle the sisters, piece by piece, using the very law the women had so carefully twisted to their advantage. Morton proposed a legal siege. If we cannot accuse them of murder, we will strangle them with writs, debts, and seizures. Let their land drown beneath paper. Whitcomb agreed, offering to dig into the sisters' finances for weaknesses. Reverend Yoder added a different venom: we will turn the flock against them. If the people refuse to trade with them, their fortune collapses. But not all were convinced. One merchant, nervous, asked the question none wished to hear aloud: and if they are what people say? If they truly walk with curses at their command? Silence followed, heavy and uneasy. Meanwhile, the sisters sensed the storm before it broke. Catherine intercepted whispers in markets. Bridget noted strange movements in court. Sarah overheard drunken boasts. Margaret, the quietest of them now, confessed one night as the 4 sat in their darkened kitchen: they will not stop until one of us falls. Bridget's response was calm, chilling. Then we must remind them that law is only as strong as the fear behind it. The sisters prepared, not with fire, but with foresight. Accounts were hidden, deeds transferred, allies quietly secured. And Sarah, restless as ever, sharpened her tongue for the inevitable confrontation. The conspiracy had begun. Lancaster's men believed themselves hunters at last, but in truth they had entered the snare. The first strike came in the spring of 1847, when court summonses appeared nailed to the Brennan gatepost. The accusations were framed in tidy legal phrases: unpaid levies, irregular deeds, encroachments on shared pasture. But anyone who could read between the lines saw the truth. It was a declaration of war. Judge Morton's signature bled across the documents like a personal challenge. The sisters read the papers in silence at the kitchen table. The room smelled of smoke and damp wool, the hearth crackling as if mocking the tidy cruelty of men's ink and parchment. Sarah slammed her palm against the wood. They mean to bury us alive in paper. Catherine's eyes narrowed. Then let us show them we are not soil to be shoveled, but stone to break their blades. And so began a duel not of swords, but of filings, countersuits, and appeals. For every writ sent against them, Bridget unearthed a clause, a precedent, a forgotten statute that bent the law back in their favor. Their late husbands' names, once thought to weigh them down, now became shields, their estates tangled enough to frustrate even the most meticulous clerks. The townsfolk watched in awe and dread. Each week the courthouse doors groaned open to reveal yet another round of Brennan defiance. Morton grew red with fury, his rulings overturned in higher courts. Whitcomb's bankers found their liens countered with clever maneuvers that left them chasing ghosts. Even Reverend Yoder's sermons, dripping with warnings of Jezebels and witches, faltered when his own parishioners whispered, "But have they not always prevailed? Perhaps Providence is with them." But yet the sisters did not emerge unscathed. Margaret, still the most fragile since Calloway's death, withered under the endless strain. Each parchment delivered felt to her like a nail driven into her coffin. She spoke less, ate less, her eyes darkening like pools that reflected only grief. Sarah tried to jolt her spirit with fierce words, but Margaret merely shook her head. The law does not tire, sister. Men can write it forever. We are but flesh. Bridget, hearing this, pressed her hand against Margaret's and whispered, "Then let us remind them that flesh can bleed, and make them fear their own mortality again." The legal war raged on, but beneath it ran a darker current. If the courts failed, Lancaster's men would surely seek sharper weapons, and the Brennan sisters knew it. By the winter of 1847, Lancaster's patience had snapped. The courthouse war had drained coffers, bruised egos, and humiliated Judge Morton in front of neighboring counties. The Brennan sisters, widowed and alone, had somehow held an entire male establishment at bay. That humiliation was unbearable, and humiliation breeds cruelty. The conspirators gathered one night in the cellar of Wickham's banking hall. The air stank of damp earth and oil lamps. Men spoke low, their voices thick with drink and venom. Morton slammed his fist against the oak table. "If parchment cannot silence them, then let us do what Lancaster men have always done. We take matters into our own hands." A hush fell, but Reverend Yoder was the first to nod. The serpent must be crushed at its head. Remove the sisters and the rest collapses. They have no heirs, no bloodline. Erase them and Lancaster is free. The plan took shape quickly, whispered with the eagerness of men cloaking murder as duty. They would not risk open violence in daylight. That would confirm every rumor of corruption. Instead, they would send men in the night masked, armed, and merciless. The Brennan house would be entered quietly, torches lit, its occupants dragged into the cold. The town would awaken to ashes and silence, and the sisters would be remembered not as martyrs, but as a caution. But in their arrogance, they overlooked one thing. The Brennan sisters had always been listening. Catherine had long since bribed a clerk in Whitcomb's employ, a timid man with debts of his own. That night, while the men plotted, a message rode swift across the frozen roads to the Brennan farm. Bridget unfolded the note by candlelight. Its ink was rushed, smudged, but its meaning clear. They are coming. Soon. The sisters did not panic. They prepared. Locks were reinforced. Lanterns were stationed at every corner. Margaret, pale though she was, helped lace iron nails into planks to bar the doors. Sarah cleaned her late husband's musket and laid powder and shot in tidy lines upon the table. And as the wind howled outside, Bridget whispered a vow into the flames of the hearth. "If they wish to burn us, let them learn what fire feels like." The night of reckoning was no longer approaching. It was at the doorstep. The night fell thick and black, the kind of darkness that swallows even the moon. Lancaster's streets lay silent, but out on the frost-stiffened road to the Brennan farm, boots crunched in unison. A dozen men moved like shadows, faces masked with kerchiefs, hands gripping torches and cudgels. Their breath plumed white in the air, but not one spoke. The weight of their mission pressed silence upon them. Inside the Brennan house, every candle had been snuffed. To the intruders, it appeared sleeping, vulnerable. But behind shuttered windows, the sisters waited still and watchful. The air inside was tight with anticipation, the crack of burning logs in the hearth the only sound. Sarah knelt beside the musket, her jaw locked. Margaret trembled but stood with an oil lamp clutched to her chest. Catherine whispered prayers not to heaven, but to memory, to the faces of the men who had wronged them. And Bridget, ever the strategist, traced each sound outside with her eyes narrowed to slits. The first strike came sudden, a boot against the door, splintering wood. A second blow, then a third, until the lock strained and cracked. The mob surged forward, torches raised. Flames painted their masks orange as they shouted curses and threats. But the sisters did not scream. They did not plead. The door burst open, and instantly chaos erupted. Sarah fired the musket, the blast deafening in the small space. One intruder fell back with a howl, clutching his shoulder. Margaret hurled her oil lamp, shattering it at the threshold. Fire licked across the floorboards, torches and spilled oil merging into a wall of flame. The men staggered, their courage faltering, as the house itself seemed to roar against them. Bridget shouted above the cower. "You thought we would cower. You thought we would kneel. This is our home, our ground." Panic set in. Some men fled back into the night, tripping over each other, their torches flailing wildly. Others tried to press forward, but smoke choked their lungs, and the sisters struck with whatever weapons they had. Poker, knife, even stones from the hearth. The intruders had come to burn women alive. Instead, they found themselves battling fire and fury more relentless than their own. By the time the last man stumbled into the cold night, the Brennan farm stood defiant, flames licking but refusing to consume. As if even the fire itself bent to the sisters' will, the mob had not destroyed them. It had only awakened something far darker. Morning in Lancaster brought not peace but whispers. Men stumbled back from the Brennan farm, burned, bruised, and humiliated. Some bore sinned coats and blistered skin, others limped with cracked ribs or bloodied arms. Yet none dared admit openly what had happened. They had gone to destroy 4 widows, and instead they had been driven into the night like frightened boys. But towns are hungry for stories, and stories cannot be contained. By noon, rumors spread faster than fire through dry fields. Children whispered that the sisters had conjured flames that leapt from the very floorboards. Wives told each other that the intruders had seen shadows moving inside the house even when no lamp was lit. One man, half drunk in the tavern, swore he had looked into Bridget's eyes through the smoke and seen them glowing red as embers. Judge Morton seethed in silence. Reverend Yoder raged from the pulpit, denouncing witchcraft, declaring the Brennans or natural women, who would bring ruin on Lancaster if not destroyed. But the louder he preached, the more his congregation shifted uneasily in their pews. For what if the sisters truly were favored, or cursed, by powers greater than any church or court could master? The sisters themselves emerged only once in those days. Catherine rode into town on horseback, her black cloak trailing behind her, to collect supplies. She spoke not a word, yet no man dared bar her path. Sarah walked beside her, muskets strapped openly across her back, daring anyone to challenge them. Merchants served them quickly, heads bowed, hands trembling. When they left, silence followed, as though the very air feared to break until they were gone. At the farm, Margaret worsened. Her hands shook constantly, her face pale as parchment. She whispered of visions. Torches in the night, blood in the snow, the earth itself rising to claim them. Bridget hushed her, but even Bridget could not hide the worry in her eyes, for though they had repelled one attack, they knew Lancaster's men would not stop. The humiliation was too deep, the fear too sharp. The Brennan sisters had not been destroyed. Instead, they had been transformed into something no longer merely human in Lancaster's eyes. And once a town names you monster, it will stop at nothing to prove itself right. The humiliation of the failed raid festered like a wound. Morton could not walk the streets without feeling the sting of mockery in every sidelong glance. Whitcomb's banking hall echoed with whispers of weakness, and Reverend Yoder's sermons rang hollow in a congregation that no longer fully believed. For weeks they schemed in private, but each plan collapsed under the weight of fear. The Brennans had become untouchable in Lancaster, so Morton proposed something darker. One evening, behind the sealed doors of the Masonic Hall, he spoke in a voice low and venomous. If Lancaster's hand cannot cut them down, then let another hand do it. One that does not flinch. One that does not fear. The men around him stirred uneasily, for they knew what he meant. Beyond Lancaster's borders, in the rougher country near the Susquehanna, roamed bands of drifters, men without farms, without families, loyal to nothing but coin. Hired blades, killers for profit. To invite them into Lancaster was to invite plague, yet pride and desperation dulled the warnings. Whitcomb, his lips thin with hatred, agreed first. We have money enough to buy their silence. Better the blood be spilled by strangers than by our own sons. Yoder, though uneasy, gave his blessing with scripture twisted to suit his need. The Lord often uses foreign hands to deliver judgment. And so riders were dispatched under cover of night. Messages carried not through the town, but along hidden roads. Coins changed hands in taverns where no Lancaster man dared linger. The promise was simple: silver for silence, gold for death. At the Brennan farm, the sisters felt the shift long before the strangers arrived. Catherine watched the horizon with hawk's eyes. Sarah sharpened her blade until sparks leapt like fireflies in the dark. Bridget pored over maps of their land, tracing every hollow, every path that could be used against them. Margaret, pale and sickly, wept quietly in her bed, murmuring words none could understand. Bridget finally spoke what they all feared. This will not be Lancaster's hand. This will be something worse. They mean to erase us with men who owe this town nothing. Sarah's jaw hardened. Then we show them that even devils bleed. The stage was set for a confrontation not of law or rumor, but of hired violence, born in coin and sharpened in hate. They came at dusk, when the sky was a bruised purple and the wind carried the scent of iron from the river. 6 riders cloaked in rough wool and leather, their horses foaming with sweat, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats. These were not Lancaster men. Their movements were sharp, efficient, the kind of men who killed without hesitation and without memory. The town saw them pass but dared not speak. Curtains closed, doors latched, lamps dimmed. Mothers pulled children away from windows. Lancaster had invited its executioners, and now it held its breath. Judge Morton watched from his chamber window, his jaw set tight, convincing himself this was justice, not cowardice. Reverend Yoder prayed aloud, though even he faltered when thunder rolled low in the distance, as though heaven itself disapproved. At the Brennan farm, Catherine saw the dust cloud first. She stood at the fence line, her black cloak whipping in the wind, and did not move as the riders approached. Sarah joined her, musket across her shoulder, lips curled into a defiant smile. Bridget, from the porch, called down, "Do not wait to greet wolves, sisters. Wolves must be driven back before they taste blood." The riders halted just beyond the gate. Their leader, a gaunt man with eyes like river stones, spoke in a voice gravelly from years of smoke and liquor. "You are the Brennan Widows." Catherine did not blink. "We are." "Then you know why we're here." Bridget's reply was calm, but her words cut like glass. "Coins bought you, stranger. But tell me, did they also buy your soul?" The man said nothing. He only raised a hand, and the others dismounted, drawing steel axes and pistols. The Brennan sisters did not retreat. They had prepared for this moment with every fiber of their being. Oil had been poured along fence lines. Tripwires were strung through the orchard. Powder kegs sat waiting in the barn loft. As the mercenaries advanced, the wind shifted, carrying Margaret's faint, broken voice from within the house. Blood in the fields, blood in the snow. The first shot cracked the silence, and the battle for the Brennan land began. Not against Lancaster, but against the devils it had paid to do its bidding. The mercenaries advanced with the steady confidence of men who had felled dozens before. Pistols cocked, blades gleamed, boots ground the frozen earth. But the Brennan farm was no ordinary homestead. It was a snare woven by grief, cunning, and fury. The first man crossed the orchard, only to be hurled backward with a scream as a tripwire snapped tight and triggered a rusted scythe from a hidden beam. Blood streaked the bark of an apple tree as his body crumpled. The others cursed and pressed on, but the land itself seemed alive, every path laced with iron, glass, and fire. From the porch, Sarah fired the musket. Smoke and thunder roared from the barrel, dropping another attacker into the dirt. She did not pause, reloading with the practiced rage of a woman who had sworn never to kneel again. Catherine, at her side, hurled stones soaked in oil toward the advancing men, their flames igniting the dry grass like a serpent of fire slithering toward their foes. The mercenaries answered with brutal force. Pistols cracked, splintering wood from the porch. An axe bit into the farmhouse wall. One rider, snarling, vaulted the fence and charged straight for the door, only to be met by Bridget, who swung an iron poker with both hands. The blow split his jaw, teeth scattering like grains of salt in the dirt. Inside, Margaret wailed, her thin voice rising above the chaos. "The snow is red!" "The snow is red!" Her cries seemed less human than prophetic, a dirge that rattled even the hearts of killers. One mercenary faltered at the sound, hesitating just long enough for Sarah's shot to tear him down. But the sisters, though fierce, were flesh and bone. Catherine's cloak tore with a grazing shot, leaving a burn along her shoulder. Bridget's arm bled from a blade's kiss. Smoke thickened, choking their lungs. The attackers regrouped, circling, relentless, their leader shouting orders with the cold precision of a man accustomed to slaughter. Still, the Brennans refused to yield. Every inch of ground was bought in blood and fire. Every step forward answered with defiance. The farmyard echoed with screams, gunfire, and the crack of burning timber. By midnight, the mercenaries realized what Lancaster's men never understood: the Brennan sisters did not fight to live. They fought to ensure that if they fell, the earth itself would remember their fury. The farmyard was a charnel ground. Smoke billowed in thick sheets, glowing orange from the fire that licked at the barn rafters. The air reeked of gunpowder and blood. Still, the mercenaries pressed forward, driven not by loyalty, but by the weight of gold promised for Brennan blood. Catherine staggered, her shoulder bleeding where lead had grazed her. Yet she stood firm, gripping a rusted hatchet in one hand and a torch in the other. Sarah's musket thundered again, each shot punctuated by her feral cry, "This is our land!" Bridget fought with grim efficiency, her iron poker now bent and slick with blood. And Margaret, frail, trembling, near collapse, remained in the doorway, her eyes wild, her voice breaking the night with prophecies that chilled even her sisters. The snow runs red, the house falls black, none leave alive. The mercenaries hesitated. Some muttered prayers. But their leader snarled, snapping them back into motion. "They're only women! Finish it!" He lunged toward the porch, pistol raised. That was when Bridget struck her final plan. From the barn loft, hidden beneath tarps, lay barrels of powder saved from Calloway's storehouses. She had kept them for months, a secret weapon never meant for simple defense. With fire crawling ever closer, she realized the time had come. "Catherine, Sarah, pull back," she shouted, her voice hoarse. The sisters obeyed without question, dragging Margaret deeper inside. Bridget raced to the barn, flames already devouring its walls. She seized a lantern, smashed it against the powder barrels, and leapt back as the world erupted. The explosion shattered the night. A thunderclap of fire tore the barn apart, hurling men, timber, and ash high into the sky. Horses screamed and bolted. The ground itself shook, a blast so fierce that windows shattered across the farm. The mercenaries were thrown like ragdolls, their cries swallowed by the roar. When the smoke thinned, the survivors crawled in terror, faces scorched, ears ringing. Their leader, bloodied and broken, dragged himself through the mud, only to see the sisters standing amid the inferno. Catherine with her torch, Sarah with her musket, Bridget with her suit, blackened hands, Margaret swaying like a spectre in the doorway. To the men, they were no longer widows. They were avenging furies born of fire and blood, and in that moment fear outweighed gold. By dawn, the farm lay in ruins, yet the sisters stood. The barn was reduced to a smoking crater, the orchard littered with broken bodies. Of the mercenaries who had come so boldly, only 2 crawled away, their faces half burned, their minds fractured by the memory of women who had risen from fire like shades of judgment. They did not return to Lancaster. They did not return anywhere. Men whispered they wandered aimlessly until the river swallowed them. Lancaster awoke to news carried not by word of mouth but by silence. Judge Morton kept to his chambers, pale and trembling, unable to reconcile law with what had unfolded. Whitcomb shut at his bank for a week, his coin suddenly useless against dread. Reverend Yoda thundered from the pulpit that witches had triumphed, that Lancaster must rise again. But fewer and fewer filled his pews. Even the faithful knew, if God himself had willed the sisters' destruction, why had they survived every attempt? The Brennan farm became a monument of fear. Charred beams jutted like blackened teeth against the horizon, yet the sisters remained within its walls, unbroken. Farmers passing by swore they saw figures moving in the smoke at night, heard chanting carried on the wind. Children dared each other to run to the gate, but never crossed it. Lancaster stopped calling them widows. They were the black brides of the farm, cursed, immortal, and untouchable. Inside, the sisters bore their own scars. Catherine's wound festered, though she refused to show weakness. Sarah's laughter, once sharp, now carried a madness at its edges. Bridget, haunted by the blast she had unleashed, grew harder, her gaze distant. And Margaret, frail, whispering visions, faded into something less than flesh, more than ghost. She spoke of graves not yet dug, of names yet carved, of Lancaster's doom sealed the night they first raised fire against them. The town did not strike again. It could not. Fear had woven a wall higher than stone, thicker than steel. Lancaster's men had thrown law, mob, and mercenary at the sisters, and still they stood. What remained was legend, and legends once born never die. To this day, in hushed corners of Pennsylvania, old voices speak of the Brennan Widows, of the fire that would not consume them, of the blood that sanctified their land, of the night Lancaster learned that some women are not meant to be broken, only feared. The Brennan name did not vanish into history. It became its own curse.